We're talking about turning your passion into profits today for our first panel, and this is an opportunity for our panelists to talk about their experience and their journey getting their intellectual property, how it's affected their business, how their operations run. So we're going to talk to Robin today. We have Robin James here with us, and we have Eric Pearson. So we'll start today with both of you introducing yourself briefly. I'm going to ask you guys to tell your story a little bit. So take about 3 to 5 minutes to introduce yourself, your product, and where you are in development, and then we'll start the discussion from there. So Robin, we'll start with you.
Hello, everyone. I guess now afternoon, officially afternoon here at the U.S. Patent Office. Thank you so much for having us out here. So once again, I'm Robin James, and my product is the Infusion Clip. And so to set all of this up, it happened in kind of an unlikely scenario. So what happened is I was out at a golf course, and I was the only woman out there hitting golf balls. And this dad and his little girl came up to me on the range and asked me to show the little girl how to hit a golf ball. She got it up in the air, and she was ecstatic. And I wanted to encourage her along the way, so I took a little rhinestone trinket called a ball marker, just like this little bumblebee. And I gave it to her, telling her that, golf is like life, and to know where you're going, you always have to know where you've been. And that's what a ball marker does for you. So she was excited, and she and her dad, left that day. And she reached out to me years later on social media, and she said, thank you, that she remembered that day because she remembered wanting to be just like me. And I was like, oh man, I've inspired somebody to the next level. Well, then I look at her page, and there she was, all grown up with a beautiful golf swing, and on her hat was the bumblebee that I gave her. So now in my own life, I was working on becoming an LPGA teaching professional. So I would encourage my students to find a marker that was more than a marker, that it was a meaning. And so people couldn't find exactly what they wanted, so I started 3D printing little markers for them. So this woman, she would travel around the country in her RV, and that meant a lot to her. So I made her a little RV. But since they were hand-painted, they wouldn't stay on the hat very well. And so I invented a rubber clip to keep that marker on their hat. Well, the rubber smelled bad, so I added essential oils into it. And lo and behold, my golf students told me that I was keeping the bugs out of their face. So not only did that little girl inspire me to become one of 18 Class A LPGA teaching professionals in the world, but she also encouraged me that very day with that bumblebee to invent the Infusion Clip. And now we're in 27 stores across the country and also online. So it's been amazing.
That's fantastic. And my miniature golf game is amazing. So maybe you can help me with that.
That's where it starts.
So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Make sure this thing's on here. Thank you for having us. This is an honor. I'm Eric Pearson. I'm the founder of Alpen Bike Storage, and this was a concept that came to be out of personal need. It's a story we hear a lot from entrepreneurs trying to solve a problem for themselves. My problem was that my bikes kept getting stolen. I've been a biker my whole life. At the time, I was living in San Francisco and commuting to work across the Golden Gate Bridge, reverse commute every day. So I relied on having easy access to my bikes. But of course, I lived in very small, cramped, wildly overpriced San Francisco real estate. And so the bikes were, in order to keep them dry and keep them safe, would generally be like leaning up against the kitchen sink or the washing machine. So I was kind of stumbling over them, and getting my pants dirty and greasy as I would slide by them. And so I figured, well, there's got to be a better way. I have this terrible little back patio that wasn't good for much. Started Googling around and figured there's got to be a solution for like a nice outdoor waterproof container that I could put out on that crummy patio, and it didn't exist. And I was kind of surprised by that. And so that was kind of the light bulb moment for me. And I thought, well, if this is a problem for me, maybe it's a problem for a lot of cyclists around the world. And indeed it was. And so I had no background in industrial design. So I really didn't know where to get started. But a chance meeting with an industrial designer all of a sudden enabled me to take sort of this concept from, cocktail napkin sketches to a CAD design. And all of a sudden, I was like, wow, this really looks cool. There might be a market for this. And so we ended up bringing to market after a couple of years the Alpenbike capsule, which is a roto-molded. It's actually roto-molded by the same guys that make Yeti coolers. So think of like a giant Yeti cooler that's circular in its form factor, quite, in our opinion, aesthetically pleasing, interesting user functionality, but keeps your bike, dry in an outdoor environment. Has an integrated lock, and so it keeps it from getting stolen as well. I would have been the consumer of that product had it existed when I lived in that terrible little San Francisco apartment. Would have lived on my back patio, would have solved a big problem for me, and would have hopefully avoided the 6 bikes that I've had stolen throughout the course of my life. And so I was thinking, well, what do I do with this product? I feel like we're onto something. It's a neat product. I now understand, I think, how to manufacture it. Where's the market? And so we launched it as a consumer product, but pretty quickly, we started looking for avenues for commercial applications, and that's kind of where our business has been focused now, is in installing a whole series of these things in apartment buildings and office buildings. We're getting into the university market right now, and it's been a really fun journey. But necessity being the mother of invention, I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. And I'm guessing if you hadn't had those 6 bikes stolen, you could have put the money back into development. So that would have been a great way to go. But I really like this panel discussion because these are 2 people who started their innovation journey at home. And they're 2 different scales of operations. So there's something we can learn from both of them for smaller business or a larger operation potential, and the growth and development that each one takes. So today we have that opportunity to learn from both of them. So I'm going to ask Eric first, where are you now with your production? How is it going for you, and where can people find your innovation? Is it publicly available through developments, or are you selling individually? What are you doing with your product at this time?
Well, we're doing both. Like I said, initially it was just a consumer product. So I was trying to sell you an individual unit that you would put on your back deck or something like that. Of course, you only needed one of them, and you were unlikely to come back and buy 1,000 of them, like a giant, commercial landlord might. And so the bulk of our business, we do still sell them, the ones and twosies to consumers. We've delivered them. I think we're in 11 or 12 countries now, a lot in Europe, as you can imagine, being a big bike culture. And we have consumer product in probably 25 or 26 states in the U.S. But our core business model really is more partnering with landlords and universities, and now municipalities as well. And our business model is more of a revenue share model. So it's a rather than just a one-off sale, let's participate in this rental income that these things are able to generate. So it creates a long-term revenue stream for us. But in terms of production and manufacturing, we're proudly made in the U.S., in Wisconsin, which I know is near and dear to your heart. And that's something we're very, very proud of. All we hear about these days of trying to, onshore supply chain. It's pretty important to us.
Yeah. And it's an amazing story. So I live in Wisconsin, that's the connection, and I want him to stay in Wisconsin for opportunities, obviously, for my state. But Robin, you're in 27 stores now, you said. What is the future for your product? I know we talked previously to this panel about you're in golf shops, but other use and potential, what are you looking for growth opportunities in the future?
Yeah, so I started with what I know, which is golf. And then I quickly found that people were using it elsewhere. People were coming back and they're like, hey, I need another one because I put one in my tackle box for for fishing. I gave it to, my spouse when we went out to listen to music on the green, all sorts of different things. So we just onboarded our first lawn and garden nursery. So it's expanding out from there. And now, as a small business in the manufacturing part, now we're scaling. I used to do 500 a week by myself, and now we're on track based on the requests and the forecasting. We're on track for 10,000 a month. And so now we're looking to scale up on that. And I think one of the things that has been so popular about why we're scaling like this is the visibility to it. You meet somebody who's wearing it, and you can physically see the bugs move away from your face. So it's been very, very popular. It's not something that people have to, imagine working or explain a whole lot to it. You just put it on your hat and you watch them float away. So it's been a lot of fun. So now the next stage, though, is the scaling part.
Wonderful. And we're going to talk more about that. So each of you have intellectual property, you have your patents, you have your trademarks. What was your journey like when you started? What resources did you utilize or find during your process that may help somebody who's here? What worked for you? And we'll start with Robin on this one.
So some of the resources is the community of inventors. I would not be here without sitting in a room with other people and just asking questions of them on how do you do it. And this community is wonderful because everyone wants to help. And everyone who's part of this community has sat there and struggled with a lot of the same things. So they were able to recommend different lawyers that had a history of working with people who just had an idea that they wanted to get to the next level. So finding those maker type communities was really important to me.
And Eric, for you?
Mine came really through that industrial designer that I mentioned. He was a designer for a large medical device company, and I was very hesitant really to talk about the idea openly until I had a patent, and I'd never filed a patent. Really didn't know much about the process, but I knew I had this notion that I needed it before I really let the idea out there. And so he introduced me to one of his patent attorneys down in Houston, who was not pro bono, but he cut me a pretty good deal to file our initial provisional, and that sort of freed me up to start really talking about the idea and trying to figure out how to bring it to market.
Awesome. And I think you also had an attorney you worked with pro bono as well, correct? Or
So there was a part that I did pay for, but in this makers community of people who are just sitting there building everything, they would provide resources to me, and they would say, hey, have you gone to the U.S. Patent Office website and looked up this? So it was a lot of going online and reading about stuff, and there's a ton of free resources out there. So that was kind of the start of things. And then when I actually was filing for the provisional patent and things, I did hire somebody.
And I'd just like to point out the provisional application process. Both of you took advantage of that, and different reasons for different people. But Eric, in your case, you used it to protect your idea as you developed it. And can you talk a little bit more about how that helped you in the process? What comfort level did that give you?
Definitely. Well, I didn't know anything. I didn't really know that the provisional was an option. And, so what I think is great about the provisional is that it allows you to continue developing your idea before all of your T's are crossed and I's dotted in your actual patent application. It's a 12-month.
Yep. Until you file for your utility, correct? Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so that was pretty straightforward and not terribly expensive. Didn't have to go into nauseating detail about the product, which those details we really didn't know yet. But it was just a great sort of placeholder to have that gave me a big level of comfort to really start communicating about this thing and bringing in additional resources, to help get it to market.
Absolutely. And for you, was there any benefit for you? Did you already know what you were going to do, or were you still in development when you filed for your provisional?
So I had no clue. I was just trying to get these little markers to stay on people's hats. And it wasn't until my golf student said, hey, yeah, like put this away and go talk to somebody. So I didn't really know. I know people are always worried that somebody's going to take your idea. Well, that is a huge thing. I don't recommend just blasting it out there before you talk to an attorney about things. But a lot of the development process, like no one believes you until they believe you, right? Like think about Henry Ford. He probably was walking around talking to his friends like, hey, like I have this iron horse that I'm gonna do. Like, and they're like, what? And, like,
Good luck, Henry.
yeah. So, while yes, do find the proper resources, a lot of it's you. And a lot of it is you sitting there up at night at 2 a.m. going, well, how can I make this better? So do file for the provisional so that you can test it more. But at first, everyone thinks you're crazy.
That's a good point. So just to interject, is that I think you're right. Most people do think you're crazy, and so we are worried about people stealing their ideas. But at the very earliest stages of an idea, especially for something that doesn't really exist, I think there's almost a natural barrier to entry because it does take so much effort, even to bring a simple product to market. That are there really that many people out there that are going to invest that time and effort in developing something where there's no visible, addressable market, and people think it's crazy.
No, and I think it's great that you talk about that in the early invention, and is it something that's in the market? So I'm going to ask you a question I didn't have planned, which is, how did you research if something like what you created was available? What kind of research did you do, and how did you find a network to help you do that research? So I'll leave that open. Who wants to fight for it?
So that was part of, as I was reading through stuff and doing my initial searches on the U.S. Patent Office, because you can search the database and things, and I wasn't finding anything kind of like it. And so then I kind of was getting excited, and at that point I was like, okay, time to get the professional to do it, and then the lawyers take it through a intensive research process to make sure. So
Awesome.
I mean, I started, just with Google searching, like so many of us do, and I guess hoping that the folks at Google weren't going to see, all this interest in upgraded secure bike storage, so incognito tabs, I guess, and things like that. But that's just part of that does, I think, allow you to see if there is a competitive product on the market. What it doesn't do, what's more challenging, I think, is understanding if there is IP on it already, or even some old expired patent that's going to make it difficult for you to get it. And if there is that something that can be licensed? Does it really block all potential paths to bringing it to market? I think it's not the death knell, even if your search does uncover something. And I've had actually have a young guy who works for me now that I met because I was helping him with some IP, and he found that there was already pretty strong IP. It was international on exactly what he was trying to build, and this poor guy was just crushed. And I said, well, this is not the end of the road. It's an obstacle, sure, but their product's not on the market. Who are they? Let's understand. Is there a real likelihood of this product coming to market? And in that case, I don't think there was. But I was so impressed with his efforts on this that I hired him, and he's now my chief of staff.
Oh, wow. That's an amazing story. And it goes to show you the importance of the search and why it helps the inventor. So thank you for sharing that. And my next question, now that you have your intellectual property, how has it benefited you and your company and what you do? What has it done for you?
You want to take it?
So for me, I am, as far as I can tell, the only African American female in the golf space with a patent. as far as I can tell. So there is just this huge, thank you. There's just this huge pride in it because it's not an easy process to bring something to fruition. And I'm just so proud. My patent number is 11,191,314.
One more time for the people in the back.
But I mean, it is just, it's a very, very unique thing to have, to think that in the entire history of the U.S. Patent Office, I'm number 11,191,314. You know, it's really fun.
Congratulations. Eric, do you know your number?
I'm embarrassed and ashamed that I don't. Now, I'll
only have
caveat
one.
that we do have several now. So
Yeah, I have one, so.
I can't remember that many numbers. But beyond just the personal satisfaction, I do remember growing up, and I've always been a tinker and wanted to sort of invent and create, and just being impressed by patents and people that had them, and met some people early on that talked about their patents, and some of which were worthless and never amounted to anything. But I was like, that is so cool. That guy has a patent. So there is that personal gratification. But then I think it really helps, particularly on the investor fundraising side of things. Depends who you're raising money from, I suppose. But and it depends on the product and the space that you're playing in. But a lot of investors do want to see that. For some investors, it's just kind of a checkbox. They're not going to dig super deeply into exactly what your IP protection is and the ramifications. They just say, "Oh, great, okay, he's got IP. We'll move our investment evaluation to the next level." So that's something that came up a lot for me even in some of those early investor conversations.
And that's a beautiful segue to our next question, because I want to talk about funding opportunities. You both have different experiences with funding, and since you started it, Eric, I will punt it to you to let you start the process for finding funding and investment opportunities. You started talking to us prior to this panel discussion about, mentioning it in a room and somebody saying, "Yeah, I'd invest in that." Can you tell us about that experience and where that led you with funding and opportunity?
Sure. Well, I think they'll always tell you that it's a terrible time to be raising money, and it's really hard. And it is. Even under the best of circumstances, raising money generally takes longer than you think, and is really hard. And it takes up a lot of the bandwidth, which can be frustrating when you want to be operating your company and you're spending what seems like all of your time raising money. But where the IP for me, I would say that the confidence that having that provisional allowed me to start talking about the idea just in social situations, just to friends. "Hey, I'm working on this thing. What do you think?" And that first moment, I can remember I was at a party, and I mentioned it to a friend of mine, just very casually, and he said, "Well, that's a great idea. I'd invest in that." And I was like, "You would? How much?" "I don't know, $5,000. And I was like, wow, that's that could go a long way, actually. And that moment right there sort of emboldened me to think about, okay, well, if he's in, could we cobble together a few more? And we ended up raising $100,000, which at the time seemed like all the money in the world, but it allowed me to really start thinking about R&D and bringing on the right designers and engineers and iterating on our manufacturing processes. And then you extrapolate that, we've now raised over $4 million, and the check sizes got bigger, and the sophistication of the investors got bigger and bigger. We're still pre-institutional, but some pretty sophisticated, like family office types. So
That's incredible. And Robin, yours is pretty much you and your family, right? So how does that work? How does the funding opportunity build from that?
So my parents, I have the best parents in the world. Not only did they support me through golf, they also helped me with things when I went to them and I said, "Hey, I have this thing. I'd like to get a patent." They helped me pay for that. So it was very much family starting things. I did have friends and other people who said, "Oh, well, we'll invest in that." but you have to be careful with other people investing in you, because every time somebody invests in you, they bring their ideas and their expectations. So I had one person who was like, I'll invest, but you have to change it to prevent bees. And I was like, what? And so, every time, so you have to be careful to keep your vision, what it is that you want. I also entered a lot of pitch competitions, and one of the things that kind of helped to add in more SKUs and things like that is I entered something called the Loudon Innovation Challenge. And our county was looking for innovation, and I ended up being the grand prize winner and won $40,000. So that really helped to buy bags, to put the product in, to expand now to 5 colors, to get into more stores and things like that. So those pitch competitions and those other funding things are out there. And then also I would give more golf lessons. I'm like, I want this display. Let me give some more golf lessons so that I can take that money and do this. So different ways to do it.
That's an interesting point you make about having too many cooks in the kitchen, and that is so true. Everyone has their ideas of where this business should go, and I get warned all the time about having too many individual, especially small investors on my cap table, which I did early on, and it so often is the case that it's usually like your smallest, least significant investor who actually can add the least value for your business, who's the one who's always calling, asking for updates and trying to interject their ideas. And then, of course, raising money from friends opens up a whole another can of worms. Money makes people strange, but it can also motivate. When you do have friends that are supporting you, you really don't want to fail. Having to look a friend in the eye, knowing that friendship could be jeopardized by failure, can drive you.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing is, don't take money from friends or family.
If you can avoid it.
Thanks, Mom, Dad.
And I will argue my parents are the best parents in the world too. So I would like to ask though, so you both started and you're working, but you don't have all the resources as independent individual inventors. So what do you do for resources to help you? How do you collaborate and focus on accounting or HR needs or any of those items that you may not be accustomed to in creating a business, but you're the inventor? How do you deal with that, and where do you find support and people to help you in your business? We'll start with Eric on this one first.
Okay. Well, I would say that there's a real difference between being able to create and invent something and run a real business. And those may be two totally different parts of the brain. Just because you're good at inventing something or designing may mean that you're terrible at running a business. And I think, we probably see a lot of good ideas fail due to that. So figuring out how to identify your strengths, but more importantly, your weaknesses and plug those gaps. If you're an inventor, but you don't have any background in accounting, well, then you better find a good, CPA or controller or CFO or something. But it is challenging. And I think I'm still at the point in this business where there aren't enough hours in the day. I am fortunate to have a team now that I've been able to push off, a lot of these things on, but it can be very, very frustrating when you're stuck doing, what seem like mundane tasks that aren't driving the business forward, when all you want to be thinking about is, selling and building and sort of positioning your product. So I don't see any way around it than just pure grind, getting up early and staying up late, and it's not going to get done if you're not getting it done. So not everybody is wired that way, I think, and even a small, boring business is very, very difficult to build, I would say.
And you have an international audience that you really reach out to for your product. So I know you've talked about people working overseas for you and people here in the US. Where did you find those people? How did you make those connections for your business?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of it came just through my own private network. But I mean, to Robin's earlier point of sort of entrepreneurial community, it really is a very supportive community. And I think it happens so often where just through talking about the idea with somebody say, oh, that reminds me, you should speak to this guy. I know somebody who does something that might be relevant in a far-flung location. And so I've met a lot of people that way. I met manufacturers through designers. I've met designers and engineers through manufacturing partners. Met my COO that way, who then brought in our CTO, who's based in Amsterdam, the bike capital of the world, and then for other roles, we've had luck just posting jobs and like LinkedIn postings, which I didn't know if they would work at all, but we ended up with like a flood of candidates, a lot of whom were very well qualified.
And Robin?
So even before COVID, there are so many resources out there. I think people don't tap into the sheer volume of information and things that, are out there just to help you. Heck, we have the SBA, small business right there. They have a ton of free classes that you can attend, not only in person, but then online. The U.S. Patent Office has things that you can, go out there and find, and resources. And then it's kind of like an online game of leapfrog, is that, you jump to this website, and then there's a link at the bottom to go to this resource, and then there's a link at the bottom to go to that resource. And so you just spend a lot of time picking up a lot of great things from all of these different government agencies. One of the things that my county has is you can walk into the Economic Development Office and get a wealth of resources. They even have a person who's dedicated to helping small businesses. So you can go in there and say, hey, I've never hired somebody before. Where should I start? And they, be prepared. You're going to get the information, but you have to read through it and know when to ask for help. But yeah, I think small businesses are such a huge driver in any economy, any makeup of counties across the country. So there's resources out there to help. So.
I promise I did not set her up for that question. I did not know that, but thank you. The resources she's talking about from PTO you'll learn about at the end of the program today, but it's exciting to hear how people are using them. And one of the resources we're going to talk about today from the government is our Manufacturing Extension Partnership in a panel later today. But I want to get into that discussion about manufacturing opportunities. How did you find where you decided to manufacture? What research did you put in? Did you have any support and utilization from any other outside resources that helped you in identifying where and what is available? So I'm going to start with Eric on this one.
Sure. I can't really point to any resources that I necessarily leaned on. Certainly not like, governmental. Like I said, I really didn't. I had no background in manufacturing or product development or design and engineering, for that matter. So I really did feel like I was starting from scratch. I didn't know what sort of materials I wanted to make this out of, and I didn't know necessarily the manufacturing processes for various materials. Our product is rotationally molded, which is a pretty cool process. It's how like big coolers and kayaks and things like that are made. I'd never heard of rotational molding, but all of a sudden I started to think, all right, well this could be a winner. Well, so who are the big players here in the U.S.? And there aren't a whole lot of them, which was kind of a good thing, actually, because I felt like I could build a fairly short list and reach out to pretty much all of them and try to find the right one. And frankly, I was very surprised and impressed by the level of attention that the manufacturer that we ended up going with gave me from the outset as just sort of a guy off the street with an idea. These guys had big time customers like Yeti and the huge corporations, and they actually served as a really good partner to help me sort of think through and iterate and modify the design to make it manufacturable. And I'll be thankful for that forever. It's not something I'll ever forget. But.
And just out of curiosity, what were your fears as an individual going into a manufacturing plant, really, and finding out what's available? Did you feel a comfort level? Did you work with people who helped you understand what they were talking about? And how did you gauge what was best for you? You said you had support, but as an individual, I'm sure you still had questions. So who do you turn to?
Well, luckily, I was able to start working with a design engineer who had a long background in rotational molding and knew a lot of the players. So he was able to, I would say, get me up to speed to at least speak a little bit of the language. But I was very, very nervous walking into this factory in Wisconsin for the first time. And I walked in, and it was a very buttoned up place, reception desk, and a big flat panel TV up there that said, we'd like to welcome today's guests. And there were only two. And it said Yeti Alpen in like the same font, same size, sort of equal weight. And I was like, whoa, this is cool. And we hadn't ever made a product and had $0 in revenue. But it sort of made me feel special. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, you did. And I think that's a great marketing opportunity if you got a picture of that Yeti and Alpen together. So, so Robin, we'll turn it over to you with manufacturing. I know you do a lot. So let's learn about your process and how you control it, because I know that's important to you.
Yes, so all of my manufacturing is located at HQ1, called my living room, and scaling it. So people so often think that they have to go to the same place that Yeti is doing it to be manufacturing. Sometimes it starts out really, really small. And I know I referenced before something called a maker's space. For those who may not be familiar with it, think about it like a community kitchen, or like you might not have the proper oven to do it, but you go in and you learn how to use this oven, and now you can make 100 loaves versus one. But a maker space does the same thing with all sorts of equipment. So you can find some maker spaces in many communities across the country that have everything from 3D printing to welding to a woodworking shop, all sorts of things. So that's kind of where I started to learn how to do a lot of those things. And then I also met people who were also on that journey. So now they're helping me with reaching out to different companies on how to find a quote for mass producing at a larger scale to get to that 10,000 that we're on target for. So yeah, it's a learning process. Do I say that I have it all figured out yet? No, but I set up a batch of infusion clips this morning before I came here, and I'll do some more when I go home. So
I was going to say that makerspace thing. I wish that I had known about that and been able to find the right one early on. I think it would have saved me a lot of banging my head against a wall, especially in the early stages where we were doing small scale prototyping. A lot of it was 3D printed and things like that. But I didn't know any 3D printers and didn't know really anything about it. But just that community, I think, that exists in a makerspace, that sort of water cooler conversation with other people that are at various stages of a similar journey. People are so open and willing to share their experiences and make introductions and things like that. That's one of the things that I find that really makes entrepreneurship fun, is that community.
Absolutely. And how did you connect to the makerspace? And what advice would you give for somebody who wants to find a makerspace?
I think go ahead.
Can you tell me where I find a makerspace? I'm a gown maker, and I make gowns. I started sewing very young. But I find that I started at home,
Yeah.
in my back room. But it's something about having a design space. When you go out, you can think more clearly. You're doing everything in that one space.
Right. So the question is, where can I find a makerspace? And it's related to fashion industry and a design space as well. But if you have any resources that you want to share that people can utilize.
So a lot of what happens at maker spaces is people want to share their knowledge of what it is. So a lot of times people will post online, like Facebook, Eventbrite, all sorts of things that they'll post about classes that they're doing to learn a different skill. So you just go out and you start looking for people posting about, learn how to 3D print, learn how to use, a certain type of sewing machine or things like that. And then you start to see that each time maybe it's at a certain location all the time. And then you literally walk into the space and they're super welcoming. And they're like, hey, you want to learn how to use this, big sign printer, sign up for this class. You want to learn how to 3D print, sign up for this class. You want to learn how to make your own horseshoes. That literally was a class, but all sorts of things. And then you start tying into that. And then of course, different social media platforms kind of, once they know that you're looking for something, they give you more things of the same. So it just kind of perpetuates finding all of those different resources.
Absolutely. And so now you've got your IP, you've gone into manufacturing, and you're selling your product. How has selling your product and marketing yourselves changed your business plan? Has it affected your business plan, and what have you done to adjust your market? So I'll start with you, Robin.
Numbers a month ago are not the same numbers now. So you just continually evolve and adjust and grow. I don't think I thought 10,000 was a number before, and now it's like a very real number. So you just have to keep evolving and growing.
Eric, for you?
Well, I think for me it was more about. I mean, one of the biggest lessons for me, and I guess pieces of advice that I would give to any entrepreneur is to stay nimble. And you may start down a path with an idea of exactly where it's going and this notion that there's going to be a big market there, but sort of maintaining that nimbleness and being able to pivot and maybe take the same mousetrap or a similar mousetrap, but point it toward a much larger market. And so that's what we did sort of in our shift from the consumer to the commercial play. I just saw a much larger market there. I saw a business that had potential for recurring cash flow, which creates a lot more value, for our enterprise. So we've pivoted several times, and then, also sort of looking at, okay, well, maybe this mousetrap that I built for mice is better suited to catching rats because it's a bigger business. But what if I was able to, add some layers of technology to not only catch more rats, but do it faster, cheaper, and maybe catch, some other rodent as well. And so that's kind of what we did. We started with an analog product that was just a physical locking key. It was just a nice looking container to keep your bike dry and keep it safe outside. But we've now layered in all sorts of interesting technology. So it's the same sort of core product form factor, but by adding in Bluetooth locks and fire safety sensors and anti-theft systems and things like that, all of a sudden new markets kind of come into focus for us, and whole new use cases where now just through the Bluetooth lock alone, everyone in the audience could have access to this bike capsule versus just you that actually has the physical key. There'd be no way for me to get everyone in the audience a key, but through a free app download, if let's say we're renting an electric bike out of this capsule, anyone in the audience with the app could locate, remotely reserve, and rent that bike. And so, that was just the pairing of technology with hardware that opens up a whole different use case that, if it's successful, the economics are wildly more compelling.
And I'm just going to ask, so you went from a physical key to Bluetooth potential. What made you make that leap? Was it something you saw? Was it an outside factor, somebody you worked with? How did you come to that next stage of development?
Well, I think we identified some just challenges internally with physical keys. What do you do when somebody loses a key or snaps it off inside, or things like that that become sort of challenging and time-consuming operationally for the business. But then I think with keys specifically, it does seem to me like the writing is on the wall, that we're going more toward a keyless society, with smartphones and apps and smart locks, on the outside of the USPTO headquarters here, key fob or app access. Now we're seeing it even more, in the home market. So that sort of seemed like an obvious pivot to me. But then from an investment standpoint, that's what I think excites at least institutional investors and VCs and stuff. They want to invest in technology. They often have an aversion to hardware for a lot of reasons, scalability and cost and whatnot. But that pairing of technology with hardware, IoT, connected hardware, I think is coming into focus for the VC community and certainly the property technology. Big landlords are implementing technology as quickly as they can. So it just kind of makes it a much more investable, interesting product, I think.
Absolutely. Do you want to add anything to that about technology changes for you?
Technology changes. I think it's more around how I go to market and how I get myself out there, where you're using it as part of the innovation itself. Mine is a very uncomplicated design. So it's more
And there's
around
beauty in that, believe me.
Yes. So mine is more around how I go to market, is where I look at that innovation. Some of the things that make it faster and easier for me to track stuff and get my name out there. So.
Absolutely. So we've gone through the whole process. You're out on the market. What was the biggest challenge you faced in the whole process that you look back on and think, this was my biggest obstacle and here's how I overcame it? So Robin, I'll start with you.
My biggest obstacle is identifying what I'm good at and hiring for what I'm not good at. That is a very hard thing when you're sitting there going, I have this amount of money that I got to make everything work. And sometimes, like for example, marketing at first, I'm not ashamed to say that one of the things that I needed to do in going to get into golf courses, the parent company, my LLC, is called Birdie Everything. And I thought that it would be really cute to have all of these little bird houses that had a metal roof, and then you could put the little magnet pieces on it, and you could have the infusion clips underneath it. It was a bad idea. So learning early on what you're good at and what you're not good at, and hiring. I've since hired somebody in marketing that has helped a lot, and the displays are not little birdhouses anymore.
And Eric?
Kind of following on to that, I would say that the ability to focus and manage your time, because you can't do everything at once, and you may have this notion that there's all these sort of lines of business that can stem off this idea, and I think there's a natural desire to want to try to do them all at the same time, but you have to prove success in one vertical first before you can go into others. And for my business, being a hardware business, hardware takes a lot of time and money to develop, and that's super frustrating when you're changing out just one little component and your designers, manufacturers tell you, sure, we can do that, but it's going to be 4 months or 6 months before it's actually rolled out. And so the software guys and the software investors will tell you that's why we like software, because we can pull an all-nighter and change some code and push it out globally, the next day. Just trying to maintain that focus and knowing that there's not enough hours in the day. There's never a day where, it's the end of the workday and you've done everything. There's nothing left to do. I'll just go home and relax. That happens never.
So that leads me to my final question. What inspiring advice would you give to inventors who are about to embark on this journey that you wish you would have known when you started?
This is the moment where I drop some sage pearls of wisdom, and it's going to be on some billboard somewhere. No, it's not. It's just the hard work, right? And it's that feeling inside of you that you can do it. I mean, it's not going to be easy. I remember I got my patent, and it came in the mail. I got the official letter and everything, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to be in all of these places. And I started making all of the clips and everything, and I did something wrong, and 500 of them snapped. Like, you would pull them, and they would snap. And I'm sitting there crying, and I'm just pulling 500 of them apart, and each one, and I'm getting more and more upset. So I was probably at, pull level 10,000 by the end of it because I was so upset. So you're going to have these moments. So find early on those people that you can call and literally cry. And they will say, I will be over with a pint of ice cream and we'll figure out a way. I don't think I realized how important that was early on, but you're going to have to find at least one person, because there's going to be some times where you're like, this is where it all ends. This is where, all of this was for nothing. So, but keep pushing past that and find that person that can help you push past that.
And Eric?
Well, and those days happen often, and that was sort of the point that I was going to make. Something that I maybe didn't know about myself going into this was, to me, entrepreneurship really is just about how you approach a roadblock, because you hit them every single day. And if you're, hardwired to hit a roadblock and throw your hands up and be like, oh, well, we're never getting around that, I guess it's all over. Well, then maybe you're not wired to be a successful entrepreneur. Now, can you through learning undo some of that hard wiring? But I think I've gotten to the point where I know there's going to be roadblocks, and I know that I'm going to find a way around them. So if just not getting discouraged. I mean, you and I could have both given up hundreds of times, and believe me, on the worst days, there are days when you're like, why am I even doing this? This isn't even fun anymore. It's never going to go anywhere, and everyone's telling me I'm crazy and we're behind schedule and all this stuff. But just persevere, keep charging. And I think probably almost any truly successful entrepreneur, the guys that have made big time money, will tell you that.
And I mean, I always think back to that little girl on that driving range with that bumblebee. And, I have that moment where I'm like, yeah, this is why I'm doing it. So make sure you have that reason why you're doing it, whether it's that pain point of you don't want anybody else getting their bike stolen, or you can just remember that little girl that day. So yeah, find that for yourself.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I volunteer to eat ice cream with you anytime if you need it. So feel free to call.
Take you up.
Chocolate chip cookie dough.
We're in. So thank you to our panelists, Robin, Eric. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.